the Q&A section, and we'll try and get to as many questions as we can. All right then, so we know that COVID has exacerbated inequalities both within wider society and our university community. And we know there's emerging research that's shown the heterogeneous effects of this pandemic. Not everyone has been affected equally, and we know that women have been hard hit. And since the start of the pandemic, we've tried to grapple with ways in which we can mitigate these differential impacts. And of course, you know, the effects of COVID aren't going to end with vaccination or the lifting of lockdown. There's going to be longer term consequences that could seriously derail progress on reducing the gender gap. So what we need to do is think creatively and ambitiously about what we can do to move towards a more equitable future. So as an archaeologist, when I'm thinking about the future, I find it useful to look at the past as well. So I'm really delighted to welcome three wonderful female scholars here who will help us do just that. So Dr. Monica Green, a historian of medicine, Janelle Tyler, a bioarchaeologist, and Dr. Robin Nelson, an evolutionary anthropologist. So I'll move straight on to our first speaker. So Athena, if you're happy for Monica to move on and share her slides. So Dr. Monica Green is our first speaker, and she specialises in the intellectual and social history of medicine in pre-modern Europe and in the history of global health. Previously on the faculties of Duke University and Arizona State University, she now works as an independent scholar. She's published extensively on the history of women and gender in Europe, and she's currently researching the reception of Arabic medicine in the 11th and 12th century Europe. This is a cultural shift that permanently altered the character of Western medicine. In addition, because of recent developments in evolutionary genetics, she's been able to use two exemplary so-called medieval diseases, plague and leprosy, and I use so-called because they are, of course, with us today, as a framework for developing insights into the origins and dissemination patterns of the world's leading infectious diseases. So thank you so much, Monica, for joining us.
Thank you so much. You can see my screen now, yes?
Yes.
Okay, splendid. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, organizers. Thank you, all the tech people who have made this possible. And thanks to all who are joining us for this session today. I have moved into this work on the history of infectious diseases in the last 15 years or so because of the developments that Becky mentioned. But what I want to do today is, this is my first time, in fact, trying to do a gender analysis of the whole plague phenomenon. And what I want to do today is simply ask, how do we do the history of women? So what I want to do is lay out some methodological interests and concerns and agendas that I think we might consider. And asking them precisely because we are experienced now, all of us are experienced now in what it means to live through a pandemic. So anyway, I think we have a lot of food for thought across time periods, across regions, and literally around the world. And before I move on from the slide, I won't be doing an analysis of this amazing mural, but this is from a chapel dedicated to Saint Sebastian in Southeast France, in Lens-le-Viaur. And I just want to point out that one of the things that I'll be asking today is asking the questions about both the biology of an infectious disease like plague, but also the cultural context. And I simply want you to note this image of showing a male surgeon with what seems to be a male assistant lancing a bubo on the neck. So the neck, under the arms, and the groin are the three most common places where plague buboes present themselves. So I want us to always keep in mind that the physical dimensions of this is an incredibly lethal disease. I also want to flag the presence of the baby in the crib there, because that's another dimension of of getting us to think about women and their social responsibilities. Okay, so what I want to do is start with a ghost story. This is an image from the 17th century, but recounting a story that has earlier origins. When exactly it originated is unclear. It refers either to the time of the original arrival of the Black Death in the middle of the 14th century, or perhaps the second wave of plague that arose in the 1350s and 1360s. We call it the Pestis Secunda. And the story is this. It's a very simple story. A woman, originally she has no name, but later the name Ricmodus gets attached to her. She dies of the plague, and she is buried. And she is buried with her wedding ring on. It's apparently a very elaborate and seemingly expensive ring. The grave diggers notice the ring when they are burying her. And in the night, they go back to the cemetery and attempt to take the ring off her finger. She arises out of the grave and chases them away. So that's the grave diggers running away. But now she's alive again. So she goes home and she bangs on the door of her house, and until her husband recognizes her and lets her in. And she goes home. She picks up her life just like she was living it before, goes on to have 3 more children, and as they say, and then live to the end of her days. This is the story that I would like us to keep in mind of what I'm calling pandemic amnesia, pretending nothing ever happened. And I think that's exactly the worst thing we could do, that it should be a ghost story. It should send shivers down our spine of thinking that what we have gone through, what we collectively, the entire world has gone through, should be forgotten. So how do we think about plague history? What I am going to argue, picking up on the work that I've been doing, is that most of our historical narratives are focused around the Black Death, this very sudden, horrendously lethal impact of the plague in the middle of the 14th century. What we now understand, and this is not a completely new idea, but it has been reinforced by this new work in genetics, is that we need to think about the second plague pandemic. We need to think about a pandemic that is in fact spreading a disease, starting all at the same time, but then spreading, and then it keeps persisting. So we are now in the second year of the COVID pandemic. We don't know how long it's going to last. But one of the things that we now understand, we're beginning to understand about the second plague pandemic, is that it started earlier, probably more than a century earlier than we usually dated. It lasted longer. Some areas were under this plague regime for 300 years, 400 years, 500 years. In some areas, the same strains of plague still persist today. It spread further. And so just as we have to expand the chronology, we have to expand the geography when we're talking about the history of plague. And the way that I like to summarize this is putting the pan in pandemic. Pandemic, of course, coming from the Greek words pan meaning all, demos meaning people, all people. And we're still in a state of discovery, but more and more it's coming to seem that a lot of the old world, of the Eastern Hemisphere, was in fact affected by the plague pandemic in the late Middle Ages and the centuries afterwards. So how do we bring women into this story? Well, actually, it's very simple, at least to get started. We ask where they are. Where are the women? So looking at our image, where is the woman? She's right there. She is affected by the disease and she's being treated by male personnel, and apparently also has some social responsibilities of her own. We ask what they're doing. In this case, she's being a patient, but also being a mother at the same time. And this is the concept that I'd like to introduce with the term intersectionality, which I hope all of you are already familiar with, but I'll use it to summarize it quickly for those of you who might not have encountered it before. Is for history, I think of this as the Bechdel test of asking, are there more, the Bechdel test comes from talking about movies. Are there more than two women in the movie? Do they have speaking roles? Do they have names? Are they talking to each other? And are they talking to each other about something other than men? So asking about how women relate to each other. Now, once we've done those things, then we can ask the main question we always ask as historians is, how does all of this change over time? So first, putting the pan in pandemic, looking at the biology. So this is just a very quick summary. I'm not going to go into detail about this. This is work that was published in December, of making the argument that the origin of the Black Death, which normally we tell according to what I call the Boccaccioan narrative. Boccaccio, the 14th century Italian writer who writes the Decameron and tells the story of the impact of plague in Florence. That is the dramatic story of plague that we have. And it's a story that really just focuses on Europe. What biology tells us is, no, we have to look at all of Eurasia. And so this is the story, and essentially a story about the Mongols. It's a story about their emergence out of Mongolia on what are originally raiding campaigns, and then become campaigns of military conquest. So they're moving into this area where that circle is here. Is it's actually a mountain range there that is home to several species of marmots that carry, and perhaps have carried for hundreds of years, strains of Yersinia pestis related to what we know caused the Black Death in Europe. So that's what the connection is. It's a spillover event of the Mongols moving into a new terrain, moving into a new ecosystem, and disrupting things. So this happens probably in the 12 teens. And then what they're also doing, and we're still putting together the pieces of this narrative, is collecting grain supplies, which they take on their long distance military campaigns with them. So that's how we get plague outbreaks happening in China, how we get plague outbreaks happening in Iran and Iraq. And then I think developing the reservoirs that will then seed the outbreaks of the 14th century. So there are outbreaks in Europe, in the Middle East, in North Africa. We're also learning more about outbreaks of plague in China, in Mongolia, and we may be learning about others as well very soon. So there's at least, I believe, 5 active theaters of plague. And the other element that comes in is climate change. So climate is shifting. This is the beginning of the Little Ice Age, and that is seems to be fostering conditions that will allow plague to proliferate. And then in the 15th century, we get another stage of where is plague is moving around. And this is what I mean by talking about the plague regime. Plague is everywhere, and it will keep popping up in various circumstances and at various intervals for, as I said, hundreds of years thereafter. Okay, so what do we know about the women who were under this plague regime? Next to nothing. Next to nothing in any kind of cumulative sense. I have simply been flabbergasted in putting together this talk of how difficult it was to find anything. So we have no data that I've been able to perceive on women's experience of plague in China, on women's experience of plague in Central Asia, on their experience of plague in Mongolia, on their experience of plague in India and Tibet, on their experience of plague in Africa. One exception, the one exception to actually tie a historical woman to a plague event is Taidula, who is called the most renowned Khatun in the history of the Golden Horde. So this is the Mongol region out of which plague emerged to reach Europe and the Middle East. In 1353, there was a plague outbreak in the Christian region to the north. That would have included Moscow. And the what we can essentially, the metropolitan, we can essentially call him kind of an archbishop, dies in this plague outbreak. And so his successor needs to travel to Constantinople, to the head of the Orthodox Church, to be inaugurated as his successor. We have the document from Taidula giving him permission to travel through the territory of the Mongol horde to be installed. And that's it. That's all we know about the plague outbreak. That's all we know about her involvement. She died in 1361, which was a year when we know plague was spreading in the Golden Horde. Did she die of plague? We cannot say. We simply cannot say. This is a little bit more concrete. This is coming from Cairo from 1419. And this is a historian who is recounting a plague outbreak. And this is the amazing thing about Cairo is they actually counted the dead. So we actually have numbers, and I think we can put a lot of trust in these numbers. I won't go through all the number crunching, but I will compare it to this study that was made of a very different kind of record from the Low Countries, from the Netherlands. This was published several years ago. And it is analyzing these essentially death taxes that are paid when people lose a relative and they're inheriting property. And for all years, there's a male, the male sex ratio is favored. So there's more men dying than women. So starting there at the top with 1.07. But in plague years, look what happens. It's 0.94. And the years without plague, it's 1.18. So that seems to be the differential. And then looking just at the year of the Black Death, a ratio of 0.89. So that means, of course, for every 100 men that die, I'm sorry, so for every 100 women that die, only 89 men will die. So women are clearly outnumbering men in terms of this data. If we add in that Cairo record, it's 0.79. So something clearly is causing a differential. Is it biology? Is it culture? Is it something about the way these women are living? So these are questions that we have to ask. The next speaker, Janelle Tyler, may give you some more information about how these kinds of analyses are done. But the work that's being done by archaeologists and the analyses that are being made are simply amazing. And the image on the right, I just want to flag because that is my personal one experience of actually engaging with a woman of the plague. This is the remains of a woman from the second wave of the plague in London. And I went to examine her because I was asking several specific historical questions about her. And that circle there on the right is the place where the molar was extracted from which the DNA of Yersinia pestis was retrieved. So that's the process of how these scientific analyses develop. Okay, so here are just some, and I won't read through all of them, but this is what we're dealing with as historians is conflicting information. The writer from Malmesbury Abbey says that women who survived the plague remained barren for many years. And if they did conceive, they generally died along with the baby in giving birth. Jean de Venette, writing several years later in France, said none proved barren. On the contrary, there were pregnant women wherever you looked. Several gave birth to twins and some to living triplets. John Meerfeld, a cleric in London at the end of the 14th century, says that there's a change in menarche, that the age of menarche has actually dropped to 11 or even 10, suggesting that girls this young were capable of conception. And Al-Makrisi, who we met before, again goes into the negative side, saying for the Black Death, that no infant survived more than a day or two after its birth, and its mother followed it into the grave. So very severe questions and very real questions that we need to ask. So applying the filter of intersectionality, asking what ways women had multiple identities in these contexts, and not simply affecting their mortality, but their experience of the plague. So we have to look not simply at who died, but also the ways in which the lives of survivors were altered. So here's a story of a woman from later in the second plague pandemic, from the 16th century. Her name, we have a name for her. We have 5 letters that she herself wrote. So this is simply amazing that we can talk about any single woman who's not elite with this kind of specificity. She is in Jerusalem. She has come there in the 1540s with her husband. She's originally from Prague. And keep that in mind as we go through. She's made contacts with at least one rabbi in Venice. So she's still tied to her European identity, but she's living in the Ottoman world now in a context of a majority Muslim community. 4 of the 5 letters we have for her were sent to her son in Cairo, and 1 was intended for this rabbi in Venice. So for example, and this is what this archive is called the Cairo Geniza, and it contains a lot of these kinds of very, very mundane documents from people. So we have, for example, she gives power of attorney to her son Moses several years before her death. She writes to him, I have not had a letter from you, and I'm scared and have no rest in my heart. She scolds him. May God forgive you that you made me so sad. I want to punish you before you die. So she's definitely doing her mother work of trying to extract favors and attention from her son. 3 years later, we get this particular letter that I'm showing you. Which is written, she opens in Hebrew, but then switches to Yiddish, which is clearly her original language, coming from East Europe. She says her financial situation is desperate. She says there is plague in Jerusalem that has affected both the Jews and the Arabs. And then the final document we have referring to her is a letter to Moshe in Cairo saying, here are your mother's affairs. She died. Whether it was right after she wrote the previous letter, we don't know. But this is the kind of dynamic we can see an actual woman living through the plague. Here's an example, horrific example of women dying, not from the plague, but because of the plague. These are the pogroms. So as I mentioned, Rachel was from Prague. Many areas of Southern and Central Europe experienced pogroms of their Jewish communities. Plague arrived on continental Europe probably in December of 1347. By May, at least, so within 6 months, Jewish communities are being blamed for spreading the plague. And a particular rumor is being spread that they're poisoning wells. We don't know if a well poisoning accusation was involved in this case of Tárrega, which is in eastern Spain. But we do know that the Jewish community was attacked. There are 6 communal graves found within the Jewish cemetery. This is an excavation that was just done. It was found accidentally in 2007, and many women and also children are among the victims. And that skull on the right shows you the kind of evidence that we have. This is a mortal blow. These are people who are actually being cut down by their neighbors in an attack. How do you experience such persecution as a mother? This is one of the most heartbreaking images I find from the studies that have been done on the Tárrega mass graves. This is an amulet that a child wore. Jean de Venette, who we met before, he says when the Jews were being burnt, so Tárrega was an actual violent attack against the Jewish community very suddenly. In other cases, Jews are being put up for judicial proceedings, found guilty of poisoning the wells, and then burned. And this is what Jean de Venette is referring to. When Jews were being burnt, mothers would throw their own children into the flames rather than risk them being baptized, and would then hurl themselves into the fire after them to burn with their husbands and children. There are other ways in which the crisis of the pandemic had effects that were not sudden, were not immediate, as occurred to the Jewish communities, but spilled over and actually set up new regimes of power and new kinds of social relations that would last years, decades, and in some cases, centuries. And this is an example from Barcelona, so very close to Tárrega. So the pandemic is gone. The lockdown is lifted, and people want to get back to normal. They want to pretend that the pandemic hasn't happened. They want to engage in trade again. They want to have good things, nice things to buy. And now that there's more money in circulation, they want to indulge in things that they love, things that give them pleasure. So in May of 1349, there are 2 expeditions, 2 boats that are being sent over to the Levant from Barcelona. So crossing the Mediterranean to go over and purchase various kinds of luxuries and other delights from the Middle East. 20 investors put up money. So the ship is going, I don't know what it's flailing with, but it's going, let's say half empty, with the intent that it come back full with new purchases. So these investors in Barcelona are putting up money. Is when you get to Cyprus, when you get to Syria, purchase these things for me. 20 purchasers step up and put money on sugar. Buying sugar, not the cheap sugar that is produced in Valencia, the high quality sugar that comes from Alexandria, that comes from Cyprus, that comes from Syria. So 20 of them are saying, we want sugar. Agnes is a widow of the merchant, Guillaume Comte. She wants azúcar de señor, azúcar and polvo de Chypre. Sugar de señor, the Lord's sugar, or powdered sugar from Cyprus. She puts up 50 pounds, 17 sous for this purchase. That would probably be the wages for a working person for several years.
Monica.
Several of them, yes, okay, I'm almost done. Several of them say that they are willing to accept alternatives, They say, if you can't get the sugar, or you can't get it at a good price, or you can't get the kind that I want, get pepper, because I know I'll be able to sell that. I know that that's valuable. Some say get incense or pepper. Some say get Turkish rugs. Another one says get sugar or powdered sugar or pepper or a female slave. And what's going on with this is a transition that we can document towards the increased use of slave labor, and particularly female labor of enslaved persons in this period. Why? Because labor's prices have gone up, and particularly the use of slave women as wet nurses, giving their biological work of producing milk, of lactating, to the owners, to their owners. And the thing is, a slave cannot charge higher wages. So this is the transition that we see. We have other indications, again, coming from bioarchaeology, to suggest the presence of non-Europeans in Europe. And one of the things that we need to do then in summary now is to ask these questions. So remembering Rich Modis and her wedding ring, here's another wedding ring. This is a wedding ring that would have belonged to a woman in the city of Colmar, which is near the border between France and Germany. There was a pogrom, and this family, or maybe it was a couple of families together, hid their treasure in a house, in the wall of a house that was only rediscovered at the end of the 19th century. That is a woman's wedding ring, hidden away for centuries because she was about to be killed. So we ask, where are the women? What are the women doing? What are they doing with, to, and for each other? And that takes us then to our modern situation of asking, something that I hadn't even time to address here is, what is the role of women medical practitioners in any of this? Are they expanding? Are they developing new techniques? Moving into new areas? What are the pandemic's burdens on working women for whatever kind of work that they have? So what I want to do then is leave you with this, a guarantee from having worked all of my career studying women is, if we ask, if we look, eventually we will find the women. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Monica. That was incredibly rich. And actually what was really struck me, and I'm sure struck many people, is just how many sort of parallels we can find. You know, I was just thinking about the sort of hate crimes arising because of the pandemic, seeing the woman getting treatment while with her child there. You know, we've all kind of, these are things that we're actually living through. So, and I think it really brings it closer to home. And what your point about amnesia is so crucial. You know, we cannot forget, we cannot see this as a blip and then return to business as usual. We have to address what's happened, and we have to learn the lessons going forward. I thought that was incredibly rich, so thank you so much. Please do look at comments in the chat, Monica, as we go on. I'm afraid I'm just going to have to move on straight to the next speaker, but thank you again. That was really incredibly insightful. Now, as Monica has said, bioarchaeologists quite like to plug gaps in history. So Janelle Tyler is going to be talking about the bioarchaeological evidence. I'm really delighted to invite Janelle back to Durham. She's a graduate of our MSc Paleopathology program, and she's actually going to be talking about some research that she undertook while she was at Durham. She's also a graduate of Ohio State University, where she majored in anthropological sciences, and she's recently finished her application to Boston University's MS program in forensic anthropology and hopes to be a student there in fall. So thank you so much for coming back, Janelle, and speaking to us today.
Hi, thank you.
It's just loading.
It's just loading, yeah. There we go. So thank you. Good morning on my end and good afternoon for everyone in the UK. Today I'll be discussing the stable isotope research revolving around a medieval skeletal assemblage from Toulouse, France. A portion of this assemblage is directly related to the Black Death. So through studying stable isotopes, we were able to study the diet of this population and infer how it changed throughout time. So we'll be looking at the bodies of the Black Death, women, diet, and social change. So see, I have some trouble.
And wanting to move forward.
Yeah.
Can you scroll? Is it because it's a PDF?
Oh, there we go. All right. So the Black Death. Just a little further background. Like Monica previously stated, there was plenty of plague outbreaks throughout the 14th century. And the plague that affected Asia, North Africa, Middle East, and Europe sets itself apart due to its high infectious rates, rapid disease progression, and immense death rates. The Black Death, at least what we know for Europe, reportedly killed over half of the population. And so that's just one of the few of the reasons why people tend to zoom in on this time period between 1347 and 1352. This immense disease progression and death rate led to numerous social changes which would shape Europe for years to come. And so the two populations that were studied come from two cemetery sites from Toulouse, France. One is Saint-Michel and the other is Troncy-Pont cemeteries, both located in Toulouse, France. I meant to put a map of Toulouse in relation to where it is, but it's in the southern western region of France. There were 172 rib samples that we studied. And just to note that there is an image of skeletal remains in the next slide. So the pre-Black Death and post-Black Death populations come from the Saint-Michel cemeteries, while the Black Death population is from the Troncy-Pont cemetery. This population is confidently dated to the Black Death due to the presence of mass graves and a numerous amount of multiple burials. The remains in these graves show no signs of violence, so it's possible to exclude a massacre or a war or warlike event. Also, there are both females and males in these graves and a range of all ages, so that also helps exclude some sort of military event. The results of a genetic study from an individual of this grave came back positive for the bacterium, the plague-causing bacterium Y. pestis, and monetary remains were also found in these graves that were dated to 1348. So that helped researchers to confidently date the Troncy-Pont cemetery as being a result of the Black Death. So since the study revolves around stable isotopes, I'll give a brief little background. Stable isotopes allow researchers to analyze aspects of human life like diet, migration, and mobility. Our research focused on carbon and nitrogen isotopes, which are used to reconstruct diet. Carbon and nitrogen isotopes, directly reflect the foods that are eaten by a person. And so looking at carbon isotopes, they're used to distinguish between C3 and C4 plants, and also marine versus terrestrial plants. C3 plants are like your rice, wheat, barley, and most fruits and vegetables, and they're mostly grown in temperate regions like Europe, whereas C4 plants are like maize and millet and are grown in tropical regions. As you can see, there's just a little chart here. Move this over. As you can see, C3 plants are lower in carbon values, or lower in carbon than C4 plants. And so individuals who consume mostly a C3 diet versus will have lower carbon values than an individual who has a diet mostly made up of C4 plants. And the same is also true for terrestrial versus marine sources. An individual who consumes mostly terrestrial sources like your pigs and your chickens tend to have lower carbon values than some who consumed a mostly a marine based diet. And then looking at nitrogen, nitrogen is also used to further distinguish between marine and terrestrial sources. Lower nitrogen values are generally between 1 to 10 parts per mil are indicative of a terrestrial diet, as we can see in this graph here. So like your herbivores, your omnivores, and carnivores are in this lower region of the graph, whereas those who consume a marine diet are higher in nitrogen. So we can see they're higher up over here. So the results of our study. When comparing the entire Black Death population to the entire post-Black Death population, we saw that carbon values were significantly higher in the post-Black Death population than they were in the Black Death population. Nitrogen values were also higher, but it wasn't as strong. The relationship wasn't as strong as what we saw with carbon. And we can just see in the graph here, the post-Black Death population are these solid triangles. And you can see they are further to my right on the graph. So they're higher in carbon. And then you can also see they're generally higher in nitrogen than the Black Death individuals, who are these blue pluses here. They tend to be lower in carbon and lower in nitrogen. When we break these results down by sex, we see that carbon values are still higher with the post-Black Death female, male, and indeterminate samples. But when we look at nitrogen, we see that only the post-Black Death females are significantly higher in nitrogen values, whereas the post-Black Death males and indeterminate samples are similar to the Black Death sample. And so this is just another graph of just looking at the female population. So the post-Black Death females are these solid triangles. And we can see how a majority of them are higher in carbon and nitrogen values than the Black Death females, which are these just the outline of a triangle. And we can see that they're lower in nitrogen values and lower in carbon as well. And so what do all these results mean? The lower carbon values in the Black Death indicates a mostly terrestrial diet. The higher carbon values of the post-Black Death population indicates there was some introduction of C4 plants or aquatic food sources. There is evidence of C4 plants like millet being produced in the southern region of France during this time. So it could possibly be that the population Toulouse were consuming those C4 plants. Though nitrogen values are much closer between the two populations, there was a wider range of nitrogen values in the post-Black Death population. So that indicates that the post-Black Death population were eating a more varied source of protein. And with the nitrogen values, specifically for the female population, the post-Black Death, we see that their diet falls more between a C3/terrestrial based diet and a C4/marine one. So there's so as we can see with the Black Death group, the blue crosses, they're kind of more in a just C3 terrestrial based diet, but with the post-Black Death group, we see there's some introduction of marine sources and possibly some C4 sources, even though it's fairly close, but still a bit of a difference. So now we look at how could the Black Death have played a role in the change in diets that we see. Well, previously in the medieval period, there were inequalities between males and females. There have been reports that women were expected to eat less than men since they were not actively involved in procuring the food. And also it was thought that foods that were higher in protein like meat were seen as heavier and more masculine foods, where women were expected to eat less nutritiously rich foods that were lower in protein, since those foods are seen as being more lighter and feminine. One of the results of the Black Death could be an increase in access to protein-rich foods for women. An increase in more nutritionally dense foods most likely had a positive effect on women's life expectancy, especially in, it could have happened in our population in Toulouse. DeWitt's 2014 sample saw an increase in life expectancy in post-Black Death London population. Also, Bulwell and Campbell found that for the first time in later medieval periods, women's life expectancy outweighed that of men. And that was due to an increase in protein and iron-rich foods in their diet. So like fish and eggs and cheeses for both classes. The Black Death could have also led to the abandonment of traditional gender roles. Times of social upheaval has been shown to lead to changes in traditional gender roles. For example, in America, women were employed to work in factories for the first time, while the men were sent off to fight in war. And going back to medieval Toulouse, there is evidence that women in the later medieval period were able to work outside of the home for the first time and earn their own wages, which would let them have some autonomy over the types of foods that they would buy and eat for themselves. But it seems like misogyny always finds a way, since women were paid less than men to do the same work, which sadly we still see today. So just to conclude my presentation here, the study found that the female population of Toulouse, for the female population of Toulouse, the Black Death had the biggest effect on diet. The Black Death could possibly be the catalyst for plenty of societal changes, especially which affect females. And this study has also shown that wide-scale calamitous events can lead to social change. I'm sorry, I feel like I breezed through that. I was a little nervous. But
thank you so much, Janelle. That was great. Right, we actually do have time for a question. If anyone has a question or two to ask, please post it in the Q&A or in the chat, or just put a Q if you want to actually come in. Actually, I'm not even sure if you can come in and speak. I'll let Athena.
If anybody does want, please raise your hand and then I'll allow you to be unmuted.
Athena has the knowledge. But thanks, Janelle. And I think one of the really interesting things that's come out of your research is, you know, that actually there seems to be there's a possibility of positive consequences. And it does look like, you know, women are having more varied diets in that post-Black Death period. You know, could that signal, greater gender equality? We don't know for sure, but there's definitely changes there in women's diet, increased life expectancy, which certainly need exploring and perhaps are filling in a gap that Monica's identified in that historical record. Do we have any questions or raised hands?
Not that I can see at the moment.
Okay, well, what we can do is just move on to Robin and then see if there's any questions for all of our panelists at the end.
We have just got one, a question in the question box. And just in terms of the recording and accessibility, I'd like to read that out if that's okay.
Yeah, please.
Okay, so the person says, "Hi Janelle, that was great. Were there any indications of higher status in your PBD sample or evidence of nutritional stress in your BD samples?"
Hi. So we were given a skeletal report of both of the cemetery sites, and there was mention that the post-Black Death cemetery could have been for like a suburban area, so they could have been possibly a population of people that are kind of slightly higher status. So that could social status could have also played a role in there. We did look at evidence of like pathologies, and I'm trying to remember, there wasn't any significant differences in pathologies. If I remember correctly, or if there was a difference, it was quite minute. So in terms of pathologies, we didn't too much see a difference, but yeah, there is evidence that the post-Black Death population could have been of a slightly higher social status.
Thanks, that's great. We also have another question in the chat that asks, were there those working at the time of the Black Death who tried to show that nutrition was linked to health?
Oh, that's a good question. I haven't run across any sources I can think of off the top of my head. I'm not sure, maybe Monica or Robin would have any input on that.
This is Monica. I would say the idea of health being linked to nutrition is as old as medicine. That's not a new insight, and most health interventions will start with diet, start with controlling your diet. I'm not sure of, and also I should say that plague tractates that we have, so treatises that many of them are meant for the general public, not necessarily meant for other medical practitioners to read. Most of those will be about diet, controlling what's called the 6 non-naturals, the parts of your environment or your engagement with your environment that you can control. So controlling sleep, controlling the air that you breathe, controlling the food that you intake, controlling exercise, and controlling sex. So yes, everybody had a lot of opinions. Whether there is a shift in opinions that we can see that might be tied to the physical evidence that Janelle is finding, that's another story. We do have a lot of medical writers in the south of France, so this is a question that certainly could be pursued by looking at, for example, at the medical treatises in Montpellier, which will be very near to Toulouse. So it's a great question. It's answerable, but I can't give a precise answer to it right now.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Monica. And there's another quick question for you in the chat, Monica, that perhaps you could answer there while we move on to our next speaker. So thank you, Janelle, that was really fascinating. So Dr. Robin Nelson is a biological anthropologist who uses evolutionary theory in studies of family dynamics and health outcomes for adults and children. Having conducted a decade of research in Jamaica, her more recent work explores the relationship between growth outcomes and residential context for Jamaican children. This project focuses on the physical and psychosocial development of children living in state-sponsored residential care facilities. So she examines what happens to the health of children when the home, as articulated in West Indian communities, is not available to them. And she's currently developing a project exploring the lives of Caribbean immigrants and their children in Toronto, Canada, with a focus on critical periods of growth and development. She investigates culturally salient forms of social and financial capital and the health of people from the Caribbean. And her talk today is entitled Thinking Small, Using Our Evolutionary Past to Create More Connected and Supported Futures. Thank you very much, Robin.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for allowing me to engage with Monica and Janelle on their work on the Black Death. I'm going to talk a little bit today about a project that's kind of, or some thinking I've been doing that's kind of unrelated actually to my primary research, but I mean, in actuality, it all ties in. I hope it's not too loud. There are, people in the community. Okay. So one thing that I've been thinking about is the way that we imagine our evolutionary past to have happened versus what has actually happened, or what evidence we have for what has actually happened. And the reason why this is important is because we tend to, and by we, I just kind of mean humans, we lean into our fantasies and myths about what it means to be human and how we got to where we are today. And so this very classic trope here of the kind of linearity of human evolution, you can see in this graphic, where we go from an ape-like ancestor to a white male. Sorry if it's very loud. Hopefully that'll pass quickly. And so I was thinking a lot about how in a lot of our conversations as evolutionary anthropologists, we have problematized this kind of graphic. However, we still kind of imagine that we are on some kind of march of progress towards a kind of more advanced and complicated and sophisticated way of being in the world. What we understand, in fact, in terms of our evolutionary past, is that it's much more of a kind of knotty bush of human evolution rather than a linear trajectory from less evolutionarily adapted to more evolutionarily adapted. We know that evolution doesn't work in that kind of directed manner. There's also been discussion of thinking of human evolution as more like a braided stream. So as discussed by Sheila Athrea, Wu Jinfi, a paleoanthropologist in China, was making sense of the mosaic of traits that he observed in the fossil record from human evolution in the Middle Pleistocene in China by thinking about human evolution as this kind of process of isolation and then commingling towards modernity. So you have these populations that are isolated and then they commingle again over time. And that there's no single, and we've heard this conversation come up much more frequently, that there's no specific moment at which we become modern in that particular way. Do you mind if I pause for 1 second? I'm sorry. Okay, I will pause. Just give me 1 second.
Interruptions in the home, part and parcel of COVID for us, but I think we're all used to it. Are you okay there? You're on mute at the moment.
I'm so sorry. There are lots of landscaping happening and it was about to come right to the door of being outside. So even if you couldn't hear me, if everything sounded good, it was about to go bad. So I just wanted to ask them to wait a second. So anyway, this idea that there's no single solitary place where we become modern. Now, why is this idea important, that there's this no single solitary place where we become modern? Because then we have to kind of rethink ideas of linearity that we are so invested in. So while we can't kind of identify gender from pictures in these kinds of myths of human evolution, we can kind of get a hint at what we've been telling ourselves, or the stories we've been telling ourselves about human evolution. And so in this illustration, it appears as though men alone are doing, and I think this is probably supposed to be Homo erectus, but men alone are doing the heavy lifting of keeping the community warm, making tools, and harvesting meat. And so what are the implications of understanding the human condition as one in which men do the fundamental provisioning and women do some kind of unpictured and unseen caretaking or contributions to the community? How does that impact what we understand our legacy to be as a species? This is not really a small question, and it's particularly important in this moment of a pandemic, Because in 1966, we know that Richard Lee and Irv DeVore organized this symposium, and this is where we get this ethos about man the hunter. It really kind of emerges in this particular moment. And we understand hunting by looking at the ethnographic evidence of particularly folks living in the Kalahari. We understand hunting to be this thing that launches us towards modernity or makes us very human, but it also becomes a thing that's specifically male, right, in this particular context. We know that Francis Dahlberg and others responded to this, what they understood, rightfully so, to be an emphasis on men's work as being the most important kind of community-based work, by talking about women and the work that women were doing and their contributions to diet and their contributions to the human story. We also have brand new evidence. This is from November of 2020. Haas and colleagues had completed excavations in the Andean highlands from about 9,000 years ago. And they found evidence of a woman hunter associated with an extensive toolkit. And there were at least 10 other burials that suggested non-gendered labor practices. So why does this matter? Well, we've leaned a bit into the appeal to nature fallacy, which is the idea that something that is natural is morally acceptable. And we've accepted this idea that men and women have specific gendered and separate roles and that are complementary but done separately. And we have evidence here that some of our assumptions about men being hunters are not as universal as perhaps we once thought. So to this end, ideas about gender and behavior and survival show up in all of our narratives of human evolution. And we tend to think about Neanderthals as having eked out short and brutish lives. We know that's not entirely accurate. So we're starting to see this diversification of the way that Neanderthals are portrayed in kind of scientific illustration as people with feelings, as people with community. And so now we're having a slightly richer understanding of the lives of our cold adapted cousins. So rather than understanding the lives of our evolutionary ancestors to be a bleak race of survival of the fittest, and then kind of utilizing that thinking in our own ideas about how to survive our own challenging periods like a pandemic, we probably need to think about a legacy that is predicated upon vigilance for community, cooperation, and coordination in our activities in order to help each other survive. So this might look like hunting in groups, cooperative caretaking behavior, awareness of others in our communities, and just intense commitment to one another. And we know that we have fossils that show all kinds of different disabilities that individuals had over the course of their lifetime, which meant that they had people in community with them, taking care of them. So how does this relate? So there's this mismatch hypothesis, right? And so Gervin and Lieberman in 2020 said that a recent and profound changes in how weird Western educated, industrialized, rich and democratic people use their bodies have led to mismatch conditions that are more common or severe when an individual's genes are inadequately or imperfectly adapted to novel environments. In kind of a evolutionary psych sort of interpretation of this, Lee et al. In 2017 said humans have begun living in environments diverging vastly from those in which they evolved, and key aspects of psychological mechanisms may be no longer linked to the environment in the same way. And so a lot in evolutionary sciences has been made of this mismatch from a very physiological or psychological standpoint. What I would like to extend in a kind of theoretical or metaphorical sense today is that there seems to be a mismatch between how we live our lives today and what we are well adapted to with regards to sociality. And so in our brave new world today, what we have are a few things that would seem, I think, very odd to our ancestors. One, we have, and I'm using the UK and the US as examples in this context, a rising market of single family homes where people are living in kind of isolated, automatized situations, and a rising what we call a built to rent market where you're building individual homes, certain people will own those homes and other people will rent those homes, right? And so you have this kind of increasing inequity due to wealth kind of ownership. And you can see here, sorry, that the green line is looking at multifamily homes. So you can see the growth of multifamily homes has been pretty much stagnant for years, and the growth of single family homes, you see it dip there in the Great Recession, but then it goes back up again. And we see this happening also if you look at the kinds of different dwelling types that we have in the UK. You see this predominance of detached homes and semi-detached homes. You see some flats, but there's a proportion, kind of higher proportion across Europe broadly, actually, of these homes where people are living separate from one another. And then when we look at kind of living arrangements of children under the age of 18 or so, people are often living with two parents, living with one mother, living with no parent present, or living with only the father. But then if you look at the other categories, like green is grandparent, you can see in very few, even in all these different arrangements, in very few situations do we have people living with a grandparent, right? We don't have multi-generational dwellings happening in the US. This is from the US Census, as frequently as we might imagine. And then in the UK, there was this kind of growth of single parent homes that's happening. And that's with a lack of older families or multi-generational residents within the home as well. So why does this matter in a pandemic? We might have been kind of eking this out for now, but in a pandemic, it gets complicated. And so before the pandemic, actually, I'm very kind of proud to say a friend of mine, Loida Limbal, made a film called Through the Night. And it was about women's lives and the need of women and family members to have someone care for their children when they do shift work overnight, and needing someone to be watching those kids overnight because the kids couldn't stay in their house overnight. And so what it really starts to say is that, and Loida says this, the women who need the care for their children are part of the same community as the women who provide the care for their children. And everyone is overworked and underpaid. And I wanted to expose the cruelty and injustice in that. Jess Colorado, who is an associate professor of sociology at Indiana University, said, other countries have safety nets and the US has women, right? And so what we're seeing in this moment of disconnection and kind of increased inequality, atomized living, is that in a moment of crisis like a pandemic, these safety nets fall apart, particularly in countries and in communities where we have not established any kind of better routinized or kind of established better systems of community care. So we know that inequality, particularly if we look at the US versus Europe, inequality in the US has increased at a higher rate in the US than it has in Europe. And so this is our kind of backdrop for March 2020, where we are all about a year ago right now, kind of going about our business and realizing our lives are going to change dramatically, almost instantaneously. And so from where I live on the West Coast of the United States, this is the kind of news reports in the UK. This is what some of the newspaper headings were at the moment of lockdown due to coronavirus. What kind of messaging did we get about coronavirus in the US at this moment? What were we told to do? Well, it's an infectious disease, so we're told to stay away from people, right? Which is going to further exacerbate some of the challenges that we're facing. And then all the other things, you know, being wary, staying at home if you're sick, washing a lot, being cautious about where you are. And what we know is that that coupled with the kind of wealth inequality that we see in the US is that we have a graphic like this on the right from New York City, where we know that if you break it down for areas of different kinds of wealth accumulation, folks who were in the poorest and most working class communities in New York City were the ones who were more likely to get sick from COVID-19. We saw a surge in US unemployment benefits happen right around this time. There was a rise in the UK, but not nearly as dramatic as the rise in the US. And we can talk about why that is in a second. So if we're thinking about thinking small from like an evolutionary standpoint, we have to ask ourselves what care is needed in a crisis and what we can learn from our evolutionary kind of history, prehistory rather. First and foremost, we need money, right? And so what happens to people when their businesses are shutting down, people are losing their jobs, people are forced to work from home or decrease their work hours to take care of the children who are now at home, when we don't have these kinds of close-knit communities that we once had, say, 1,000,000 years ago, or 500,000 even. So what we know is that in the UK, you have something called universal credit, and I was reading up on it, and you guys can talk to me more about it in the Q&A, but they were talking about how you can apply for universal credit, whether you are employed or unemployed, if you have the need. And that's not, we have some programs like that in the US, but not quite as rigorous as that. We have unemployment benefits, which we've been fighting about in the US nonstop, about how much we should give people and whether it disincentivizes them from working. And these are people who literally are unemployed right now. We also know that we have food banks and mutual aid. Mutual aid has something that's been, I've been learning more about over the past few weeks in the US, especially with the weather crisis in Texas that happened recently, where everything was freezing down and people couldn't get to stores, and it's in the middle of a pandemic. Mutual aid are usually community-based groups that are coming together to create and gather resources and then distribute those resources in the community to people who need them. So completely outside of a political, political force or political organization. These are kind of community-based organizations. And then with regards to care, we probably need to be rethinking our living arrangements, right? So if I'm thinking about this from an evolutionary anthropological standpoint, I'm thinking about how do we get it to the point where they're not people who are so isolated that they would need food banks if they ran out of food for a week. How did we get to this situation, and how can we rethink it? And so we have a food bank here in the UK, in London. This is a line for food banks in the greater Pittsburgh area of Pennsylvania. I could have chosen any pictures. There were lines, wrapped around for miles of people looking for food right around the beginning of the pandemic. And these are some folks who are working in mutual aid in Texas, gathering materials to redistribute in the community, and basically doing the kind of work that humans are adapted to do, which is to care for each other in a time of need and to know who is in and around our community with a certain level of vigilance. So when we start thinking about thinking small, the other question that comes to me often is, what happened in those other places that did not struggle with COVID the way the United States did specifically? What were they doing differently? And so we know that Thailand is launching a kind of new normal healthcare system to try to build back better after COVID-19, which includes kind of more access to care, access for people to be able to quarantine when they come into the country, to be able to keep in touch with other people given a phone, these basic things to kind of check out people's health. Now, we can talk about the issues with surveillance in these kinds of contexts, because that's a kind of different public health level conversation. But there is a tension here to the fact that the health of anyone in the community impacts the health of everyone in the community. And I think that is a lesson that we can learn from our evolutionary past as well. Michael Baker, who's an epidemiologist from the University of Otago, said that despite early fears that severe lockdowns would irreparably damage the economy, New Zealand's approach had proved that the best economic response was a strong public health response, including a blitz of testing, contact tracing, and quarantining. Now, this makes perfect sense to us as people who live through a pandemic right now. But what that requires is an investment in community. And what it requires is attention to the most vulnerable people in the community, and making sure that you're paying attention to what they need, which we have been failing to do, particularly in the US. So as I'm thinking about thinking small, one of the things that keeps crossing my mind, and stiff upper lips and American dreams are different metaphors, but work with me here. This idea that we go through trying times and we're not supposed to talk about it, we are supposed to persevere, we are supposed to push through it, that is not actually useful in terms of what Monica Green was talking about in terms of learning from our past and not kind of leaning into ignoring the ramifications of the pandemic. We don't actually need to keep a stiff upper lip right now. This isn't the time. We should actually be grieving so that we can understand what we've just gone through and create a different community moving forward. And with regards to American dreams, our kind of national zeitgeist around like independence and dispossession. I mean, frankly, it has a lot to do with dispossession, moving people off land, conquering space, taking it over, having your own space, all of this. that's not gotten us very far in a moment of vulnerability. It's not actually great to be isolated and independent when you are experiencing a traumatic moment. So I think we have to push back on these ideologies that encourage quiet about our grief and independence. We probably need deliberate and articulated interdependence that we are comfortable with, that success shouldn't look like independence all the time or wealth accumulation to the detriment of other people in our communities. We need to be moving towards multifamily dwellings. There's a huge conversation in the United States, particularly where I live in the Bay Area, which is a very, very wealthy, expensive area to live in, about the resistance towards multifamily dwellings, that people want to have their yard and their plot, and they don't want to engage in that kind of sharing of space. And what does that mean when folks are all of a sudden living through a pandemic? It's not a particularly beneficial space to live in. We also need multi-generation dwellings. We need to think about how we can provide care for people who are aging and care for people who are young so that we can all live in a community with one another. And finally, a recommitment to the financial and social safety net rather than moving away from that. And I know that's been a conversation in the UK, particularly in Britain, as well as in the US, is how much do we invest in kind of a national safety net, and why do we need to put our resources in this direction? So to this end, what we need to be doing is sort of addressing the mismatch, and not the mismatch in this sense to a physiological and psychological adaptation to a particular environment, but the mismatch between our kind of social evolutionary context and where we live and what we live in now. So I want to thank Rebecca Gowland and colleagues at Durham for having me. And this piece, I really appreciate the opportunity to think through a piece that I wrote for Nature Human Behavior about prioritizing care for a more resilient future, because that's where these ideas kind of came from. And so I appreciate the chance to talk about this a little bit more. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robin. That was really wonderful. And actually what's really interesting is, I've been going to the other panels earlier today, and, some of those themes, it's, moving away from individuals and actually what's important for our survival, actually as a university, as a country, is about creating those networks. So words like cooperation, collaboration, and words that you never hear in the leadership context, care and kindness, are those that actually people are thinking, these are really important. These are really important in terms of the way forward. And I love that connection that you've made with our sort of evolutionary past as well, and bringing that into the present. And I think it's so important to recognize that actually it's the way that we're living now. Is that okay? It doesn't feel okay right now. Yeah, no. Are there any questions for Robin? I'll give you a chance to gather your thoughts. It's the same here, Robin, with the food bank use has gone up so much, and obviously the food that's within the food banks is not the best. It's food that it's non-perishable goods. So then that's going to result in micronutrient deficiencies in the children, and that's potentially going to result in longer term health problems. And so that we're looking 40, 50 years into the future, it could be an increase in chronic diseases. Again, it's just this real short-sighted individualism. Are there any questions, Athena? No? Okay. Yes.
Just some thanks.
There's a raised hand, I think. I think I saw one. Can you see?
Oh yeah. So Asha is raising their hand, so I'll allow them to talk now.
You're on mute, Asha.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi, thank you so much for this webinar. I had enjoyed so much.
Thank you for coming.
Yes, I'm a future student at Durham, and I'm interested in medical anthropology. I'm a graduate from the University of Nairobi with an undergrad in anthropology. So, and I want to thank Robin Nelson so much for linking the past and the present so beautifully. Thank you. So my question is, in the pandemic, we've seen how women have come through for the families in terms of health, financially, socially. When the man lost his job, for instance, and is at home and he's sick with COVID and the children are having symptoms, she cares for everybody. She nurtures everybody back to health. And when she's down, she nurtures herself back to health. So that's the wonderful strength about being a woman. You just, even when you fall back on yourself. And I wanted a little bit more on the Neanderthal part. Robin mentioned how even in hunters, there are women hunters, and they found the remains of women hunters and all the tools they've used. I don't know if we can get more in the future about exposing this fact about women being the strong creatures we are.
That's a great
More
point.
of a comment than a question.
No, that's a great point, Asha. I think, you know, a lot of, so I wrote this completely separate piece, which is about like violence and what violence matters and these kinds of questions and in the anthropological record. And one of the things that like just keeps coming to me is that as we have more women in the field, questions about women's lives get addressed more frequently. And so now we have, you know, people asking this question, and Monica says this in her talk too, and Janelle too. It's like, where is the evidence for the women? And like, why haven't we seen this analyzed yet? And so part of why I kind of introduced that Man, the Hunter, Women, the Gatherer book, because as you saw women kind of rise to a place where they could do the edited volume, they were like, hey, you're focusing a lot of attention on one particular group of foragers, and there's all this diversity in what women do. And as we have more excavations and more information, we know that women are engaged in all kinds of work. And like Janelle said, the work shifts depending on what's needed. So like if men are off at war, women do these other kinds of work. And so you know, we always have to be really careful when we kind of infer gender behavior onto the past. We have to be really careful about that. But we do know that like the same evidence that we marshal to say that men are doing particular behaviors, we see associated with women, the same kind of evidence of tool use and things like that. Then we have to kind of acknowledge that it's a little bit more diverse, and we probably have to rethink some of our early assumptions.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you, Robin. I'm afraid, reluctantly, I'm going to say we're out of time at the moment. So if you have any questions, perhaps our speakers would be happy to answer them if you emailed them to them. But I just want to spend this last minute just thanking all of our speakers so much. I found that really insightful and incredibly wide-ranging and rich discussion of past pandemics and the insights that we can gain from them. You know, there's a lot of parallels there. There's a lot of themes that we can draw out. But pandemics weren't ubiquitously negative for everyone. And we know that there's that kind of specificity of context as well. But also, you know, the importance of looking towards our evolutionary past and really questioning the way that we live and the way that we care for each other at the moment, and what's not working. We don't want to return to this new normal that's looking a bit too much like the old normal. We want to like carve something new out of this, get something positive out of this really dreadful experience. So if everyone, I guess you can't really unmute, but anyway, I'm going to clap for our panelists, and thank you so much for giving up your time and speaking us today on International Women's Day. It's really been a privilege to hear you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
There's lots of thanks coming in the chat, so please do read the comments, guys.
Have a look. Yeah. Thank you so much. That was so interesting. Yeah, no, that was lovely, and thank you, Athena, for organising this and sorting out the Zoom. It's a pleasure. Thank you all for taking the time to join us today. It's been really great. Well, yeah, especially from different time zones. You're probably ready for breakfast now, are you? Yeah, no, probably a bit of a treat now. Well, thank you, and I really,
I kind of hope that we can sort of stay in touch with each other at some point in the future and keep